Hi, I'm Ann Toback, the CEO of the Workers' Circle. We've just been listening to the Yiddish version of the song 9 to 5, proving that everything is better in Yiddish. Something I always say. Welcome to 9 to 5, the movement and the movie with Ellen Cassedy. I'm thrilled you've joined us this Labor History Month to hear Ellen share some of her experiences organizing women workers in Boston, workers who took on major corporate titans and formed a women-led union. The chain of working women's activism that we will be hearing about tonight stretches from the garment workers of early 20th century New York through the 9-to-5ers, through today's labor surge. Tonight's program is especially meaningful to us at the Workers' Circle as our founding members were at the center of New York's garment industry in the early 1900s and helped lead the first strikes that led to the start of the union movement in the United States today. Women we will hear about, including Clara Lemlich and Rose Schneiderman, were early Workers' Circle members. We continue to be inspired by our Eastern European immigrant founders who came to the United States fleeing autocracy and persecution and seeking democratic freedoms at the turn of the 20th century. That history drives our work for an inclusive democracy today. We are thrilled that tonight's program is co-sponsored by Unite Here, Avodah, the Jewish Labor Committee, Jewish Women's Archive, the National Council of Jewish Women New York, and United Federation of Teachers Jewish Heritage Committee. In a moment, I'm going to officially introduce Ellen Cassedy, and through our 1-hour program, I invite you to put your questions for Ellen into the chat, and we'll ask as many of them as time permits. We'll also be raffling off 10 signed copies of Ellen's book, Working 9 to 5. You need to be on the Zoom to win. So stay on, stay tuned, and stay part of our conversation. And now, Ellen Cassedy is a founder of the 9 to 5 organization of women office workers that began in Boston 50 years ago. She is the author of a new book, Working 9 to 5, A Woman's Movement, a Labor Union, and the Iconic Movie, with a foreword by Jane Fonda herself. Ellen is a former columnist for the Philadelphia Daily News and was a speechwriter in the Clinton administration. She is also a Yiddish translator, especially of fiction by women. And now it's my great pleasure to welcome Ellen Cassedy to our program and share our screen. And here we go. Okay. Let's see here. I'm not sure if I'm use slideshow. There we are. Thank you, Ellen.
Okay, thank you so much. Good evening, and thank you, Anne, and thanks to all of you for being here. I'm very honored to join with Workers' Circle tonight during Labor History Month to talk about 9 to 5, the movement, and the movie. 50 years ago, I was one of 10 women office workers who fanned out across downtown Boston on a cold December morning to pass out the first issue of the 9 to 5 newsletter. And the front page said this: "We keep Boston's businesses and institutions running smoothly. Without us, they would grind to a halt, yet we are underpaid and undervalued." But for me, the story of 9 to 5 actually begins back when I was growing up, listening to the stories told by my grandfather, Jacob Levine, who we called Little Grandpa because he was barely 5 feet tall. He's the one on the left, the cute one. I also had a big grandpa, the one on the right, from the non-Jewish side of my family, my father's side. Now, Little Grandpa arrived in New York City from Lithuania at the turn of the 20th century, and for a few years, he was a socialist activist who ran up and down the steps of tenement houses in New York City, handing out revolutionary literature. And he told me that one day, a man opened an apartment door and shouted at him, "Get out of here, you little Jew bastard, or I'll kick you down the stairs." And my little grandfather would then pretend to muse in his thick Yiddish accent, "How is that man knew I was a Jew? I will never know." My grandfather often went to Union Square here in Manhattan to listen to a tiny red-headed firebrand, a woman even shorter than he was, who was standing on a soapbox, orating passionately about the struggles of women in the garment industry. Her name was Rose Schneiderman. And she became famous as the person who coined the term bread and roses. She said, "What the woman who labors wants is the right to live, not simply exist. The worker must have bread, but she must have roses too. Physical sustenance, yes, bread, but also spiritual sustenance, bread and roses." One of Rose Schneiderman's comrades was Clara Lemlich, who immigrated to the United States in 1903, following the notorious pogrom in Kishinev. And Clara Lemlich became famous in 1909 at a meeting in a big union hall. For 2 hours, various leaders of the labor movement and various socialists from the Lower East Side had spoken and spoken and spoken on, and then Clara Lemlich stood up and interrupted them and asked to speak, and they lifted her up on the stage, this tiny young woman, and she said in Yiddish, "I have no further patience for talk. I am tired of listening to speakers who talk in generalities. What we're here for is to decide whether or not to strike. I make a motion that we go out in a general strike." And the crowd roared. And the strike was called, and 20,000 garment workers walked out. Most of the strikers were young women, teenagers. Many of them were Yiddish speakers. The strike lasted for 2.5 months. It improved wages and hours, it transformed the labor movement, and it led to new legal protections for factory workers. Now, by the way, Clara Lemlich never stopped organizing. In the nursing home, she helped the workers organize a union, and she got management to stop buying grapes and lettuce. The stories of these brave Jewish women who I heard about from my grandfather took root inside of me, and they were a precious beacon for me, a touchstone when I got my first job out of college as a clerk typist at Harvard University. That's me on the left, Karen Nussbaum on the right. I think we're both cute. Now, led by Karen, a group of us started sitting around on our lunch hour talking about our jobs. We talked about low pay, unequal pay, training men to be our own supervisors, and having to do favors, all kinds of favors for our bosses. And I think it all hit home for us one day when a student walked into the office, looked one of us straight in the eye and said, "Isn't anybody here?" "Well, I'm here. Can't you see me?" At that time, sexual harassment was perfectly legal. You could be fired for being pregnant. That was legal. In the newspapers, there were 2 columns, help wanted male and help wanted female. Also at that time, when people thought worker, they would picture a man in a hard head wielding a wrench. And women workers, especially office workers, were practically invisible. But in the 1970s, millions of women were pouring into the workplace. 1 in 3 was an office worker. And as the clerical workforce grew by leaps and bounds, so did a sense of injustice among the women whose job it was to photocopy and type and staple and mimeograph. We wanted our rights and we wanted respect. We founders of the 9-to-5 movement were keenly aware of the chain of activism that stretched back to those garment workers, on up through the women who supported the sit-down strikers of the 1930s and 40s in the auto and steel industries, and the women of the civil rights movement of the 50s and 60s. And then on into the women's liberation movement, whose ideas seeped into every corner of American society. Maybe we thought, maybe now it was our turn. Maybe it was our turn to forge our own link in the chain. Maybe we could change the modern office, change the labor movement, change the world. Our goal was not just to get women out of the typing pool, but to make the typing pool a better place to work. As Elise Bryant, the director of the Coalition of Labor Union Women, says, there are no menial jobs, just menial pay. We thought big, but women who worked in offices were scared to take action, and rightfully so. In the downtown workforce, there was little or no history of collective action. When you had a problem, you were likely to think of it as your individual personal problem. Maybe you should dress better or take a class. The idea of sitting across the table from management and negotiating over wages and benefits was unimaginable to many women, and employers, of course, were intent on keeping it that way. The working conditions were very authoritarian. You couldn't leave your cubicle and go talk to somebody else across the room without your supervisor noticing. When we handed out our leaflets outside the big revolving doors of the skyscrapers, there would be supervisors waiting to snatch those leaflets out of women's hands. So how are we going to solve that problem? How are we going to get off the ground? Well, we started small. We started with lunch. We called up all the women who responded to the newsletter, and we invited them to meet us at a little downtown diner, one at a time. Sometimes I ate 3 lunches in one day. And that's how I learned a very important principle of organizing, which is never bring an artichoke to a recruitment lunch. Way too messy. Not everybody was a natural-born organizer, a natural-born activist. I wasn't. But a movement needs all kinds of people. So we created roles for the bold, the shy, and everybody in between. We helped one another. We changed. We grew. And in November of 1973, we called our first public meeting. We called our movement 9 to 5 after the hours of the working day. And in an echo of the garment workers' cry for bread and roses, our slogan was raises and roses. Those of us who could speak in public got up at the podium, and for those who were afraid they might throw up at the podium, we suggested bringing along a small wastebasket just in case, and our organization took off. We took over National Secretaries Week, the last week in April, which had been designated as a time for bosses to reward their secretaries with a bouquet of roses or a box of chocolate with thanks for a year of hard work. Well, we wanted our rights 365 days a year. So we announced we were holding a bad boss contest. And we invited office workers to nominate their bosses. Entries poured in, unbelievable stories. And the TV cameras rolled as we confronted the boss, this man who asked his secretary to sew up a hole in his trousers while he was wearing them. And the lawyer who fired his secretary for bringing him a corned beef sandwich on white bread instead of rye. We called out the boss who handed his secretary a suspicious package saying, "This might be a letter bomb." And you know his next words, right? "You open it." At one of our demonstrations, a woman in her 80s showed up, someone we'd never seen before. And she asked for the mic, and we kind of nervously handed it to her. And she took the mic and she said, "My name is Florence Luscombe. When I was 5 years old, my mother took me to meet Susan B. Anthony." And she went on to tell about how she herself had become a suffragist and an activist. We listened to this woman and we were thrilled. This was the chain of activism we were talking about. Now, the expression sexual harassment had not yet been coined when we got our start, but that didn't mean it wasn't happening. We knew that the more women joined together for dignity and equality at the workplace, the less sexual harassment would take place. Basically, we perfected the art of raising a ruckus. You couldn't avoid us, and things began to change. Countless bosses started getting their own coffee. We heard about a group of women at a tiny little insurance company who worked up the courage to circulate a petition demanding higher pay and a whole list of demands. And after 3 days, their boss caught them at it, and he held up the petition for everybody to see. He said, "You know what we do with these things? They go straight into the trash." Plunk. 3 days later, all their demands were met. Soon, we were taking on the biggest and the baddest corporate titans and driving them mad. We took on the biggest bank in town, the First National Bank of Boston, and declared 1979 the year of the first. And by the end of the year of the first, we'd won promotions, career ladders, a grievance procedure, and the biggest raise in bank history. We announced our next target, the biggest insurance company, the John Hancock. And that night, one particular executive decided he'd better spend all night in his office, just in case. In case what? I don't know. In case we invaded, I guess. We did not invade, but it was not long before the bank rewarded their employees with the largest raise they'd ever given, a huge raise, and gave $100,000 for employee childcare. Across the city, we started winning millions of dollars in back pay and raises. I cannot tell you how exciting it was. Actually, my book does tell you how exciting it was. It was really exciting. And I wrote the book to be the kind of thing I was hungry for when I started organizing. It's a book that conveys what it's like to work in a tiny beehive of an office for 12 hours a day, full of dreams and passion and energy, with a lot of practical organizing tips woven into the narrative and a big dose of inspiration. So check it out. Women all over the country had the same problems and the same dreams. We formed a national association with members in every state and chapters in dozens of cities. And we made a point of targeting cities with diverse workforces in order to build a multiracial organization. Baltimore, Cleveland, Atlanta. We placed a priority on building a diverse membership, leadership, and staff that would reflect the makeup of the clerical workforce itself. And that's something that didn't just happen. It took conscious effort, and it's something I'm very proud of. Enter Jane Fonda. Jane Fonda, the actor, knew one of us from the anti-Vietnam War movement. And when she came to us and said she was thinking of making a movie about the concerns of office workers, needless to say, we were thrilled. And she brought her team to meet with our members. And they popped a question we had never thought to ask in all those recruitment lunches, which was, have you ever fantasized about doing in your boss? Well, there was a moment of stunned silence, and then the room just exploded because it turned out everybody had. All those fantasies went right into the script. The movie 9 to 5 was a comedy, but it made a serious point. In the movie, 3 women get together, and as things develop, it becomes necessary for them to kidnap their boss, who the New York Times film critic described as a fine lunatic villain, a mini-brained tomcat. Once he's gone, it turns out no one even notices. The 3 women instituted a whole slew of worker-friendly policies, all the things we were asking for. And what do you know, the company actually runs better than it ever has before. Now, women office workers had never seen ourselves on the main screen as the main characters on the big screen. And the atmosphere in the theaters was electric. There's one scene where Jane Fonda is ushered into a room with a huge photocopy machine. And she presses a button and these papers start flying out of various orifices of the machine and flying all over the floor. And her lip starts to tremble. And at that point, women would stand up in the theaters and shout, "Push the stop button." So Dolly Parton wrote her toe-tapping song, Working 9 to 5 for the movie. That's the song you just heard in my Yiddish translation. And it became an enduring anthem. It was our movement that inspired the song in the movie. And the song in the movie, in turn, gave our movement a huge boost. After that movie came out, we had won the debate. Now it was time to consolidate our power. And that meant a union. Because only through a union do you get it in writing, guaranteed. And as you all know, workers in unions earn higher pay, have better benefits, and have a say over their working conditions. In 1981, the Service Employees International Union, SEIU, granted us a nationwide charter, and our woman-led union, District 925, got off the ground all over the country. Not just SEIU, but many other unions started investing new resources in organizing women workers. And they discovered that union drives in woman-dominated workplaces, especially those with a high percentage of Black women, actually were more likely to succeed. And that was a surprise to those who had told us early on that women couldn't be organized. They could be, and they were. Just like every union in the 1980s and beyond, we encountered ferocious opposition from employers. In response, we were forced to come up with some pretty clever tactics of our own, which you can read about in my book. At the University of Washington in Seattle, what turned out to work was making Tampax machines a major issue at the bargaining table. Yes, we did want more Tampax machines at the work site, but the real reason we kept talking about Tampax was that every time we used the word Tampax, the management negotiators got so flustered that some of them had to leave the room, and we won a great contract. So what did we achieve, and what remains to be done? We won a lot. Workplace issues that used to be considered individual matters are now matters of policy, government policy, corporate policy, union policy. Sexual harassment is illegal today. Pregnancy discrimination is illegal. We don't have help wanted male and help wanted female ads in the newspapers anymore. And managerial jobs are now increasingly open to college-educated women. Within the labor movement, women have risen to the top, including Liz Schuler, the first woman president of the AFL-CIO. And these women labor leaders have pushed the labor movement to prioritize not only pay and benefits, but also issues like flexible schedules, paid sick time, sexual harassment. But even so, it can be harder to be a worker today than it was 50 years ago. Low-paying, dead-end jobs are still with us, and women and people of color are most likely to remain in those jobs. The gig economy means some women, some people are working 2 and 3 jobs just to make ends meet. Fewer people have benefits, pensions, paid vacation, paid sick time, regular schedules. Computerized monitoring and a relentless pace of work make many more workers miserable. And the gender gap in pay is stuck at 82% and much worse for women of color. The good news is the new wave of labor organizing that's in full swing today. Support for unions is at its highest level in 2 generations. 71% of Americans now support unions, 88% of young people. We're hearing new voices and seeing new tactics. The Starbucks campaign just won a big victory. Hollywood workers made headlines this past year. The UAW won really big. Teachers are organizing, grad students, cannabis workers, domestic workers are organizing. 9 to 5 is still reaching out to women all over the country. Our union, Local 925, is still going strong in Washington State. And these are the people who are forging today's links in the chain of working women's activism, and more power to them. In conclusion, my grandfather's stories about the garment women were a precious gift to me. And now that I'm a grandmother, it's my honor to pass on the story of the working women's struggles I helped to lead. You remember Florence Luscombe, the old woman who spoke at our demonstration. She told us that when people asked her why she had made the sacrifice to dedicate her life to activism, she told them, it wasn't a sacrifice. I do it for the joy of it. And that's something I never forgot. There is joy in taking action. And as you know, if you're involved in the Workers' Circle mission of a Jewish culture for a just world, together we are stronger. Zusammen sind wir stärker. By adding our link to the chain, we continue the task of building a schönere und bessere Welt für alle, a better and more beautiful world. In the Jewish religious book called Pirkei Avot, The Ethics of the Fathers, the sages tell us, you are not required to finish the work, yet neither are you permitted to desist from it. Or as the old labor song says, freedom is a hard-won thing. You've got to work for it, fight for it, day and night for it, and every generation's got to win it again. Thank you.
Okay, everyone, now I'm going to ask Ellen some questions and stop sharing. And I think if any of you have questions yourself, now's a great time to add them to the chat. And we can actually see some of the chat too. So I just wanted to throw just a quick fact, because my personal hero is Clara Lemlich, and a fierce fighter and lifelong activist. I met her daughter. I had the joy at a Triangle Shirtwaist commemoration. Something that really inspires me today, since the Workers' Circle's focus has been on voting rights, is that Clara and so many other women labor activists of the 20th century turned their attention to the suffrage movement. And she was a strong suffrage fighter. So today, I think for us, as voting rights are under attack yet again, it's really exciting to be inspired by the Clara Lemlichs and the Rose Schneidermans and women labor activists. So I just wanted to throw in that plug for my favorite, some heroes or sheroes of yesterday. So let's talk about your book. I love, as a lifelong activist myself, I love your description of strategic campaigns. And yes, people need to read this book, because that's something we are committed to teaching people. You make change in the world through strategy. There's a process. It doesn't just happen overnight, although I kind of want to know what you did in 3 days to get a corporation to bend to your will. That's a very fast turnaround. So, but why don't you talk to us about some of the specific elements of a successful campaign?
Yeah, so thinking about this, in my book, I lay out a whole list of things that how you put a campaign together. But when I thought about sort of boiling it down to the basics, the first thing I thought of was to listen and to be flexible. So when we started organizing 9 to 5, we had all kinds of ideas about who would be most interested in joining and what they would be willing to do, and we were wrong in a lot of ways. But for example, we thought the people who would want to join would be the people who were sort of least invested in their jobs, bored on the job. In fact, it was the women who cared passionately about their skills and about their companies and their institutions that they were doing such a good job of working for. They wanted 9 to 5. We thought women we could sort of persuade them easily to just band together and go storming into their boss's office. That turned out not to be true. So we had to think of all these other ways of creating ways for people to take small risks, but risks that wouldn't get them fired. I remember one time I was organizing in the publishing industry, and there was going to be a big book festival, and I said, "Oh, this is going to be great. Let's throw up a picket line around the book festival." And there was this moment of dead silence, and then someone said, "Well, actually, why don't we sort of reserve a table and have a place where people can sign up to be in touch with us?" And I thought, how mild, how nothing burger. But in fact, those women were absolutely right. We immediately got a ton of contacts, and pretty soon those women were doing the boldest, smartest things. They were in there demanding things from their bosses. We filed a huge lawsuit. We won huge changes in the publishing industry. So they were right. And I feel good that I had the grace to just step back and say, okay, they probably know what they're doing. So that's one thing. Another thing is creating roles for different people. So some people have loud mouths and they're pretty confident and they're happy to speak in meetings. And, I was involved in the anti-war movement where we would hold these meetings of 500 people and people would just stand up and start talking and orating. That wasn't what we did. We had roles for people to speak, and we had practice sessions for giving a speech. And then we also had other things like bring the cookies, do the research, invite your friends. So if you were ready to stand up and speak, great. But if you needed a little help along the way, we provided that help, and we made it possible for all different kinds of people to participate. And then the third thing I would say, and this is the last thing, is don't fall prey to the rock pile theory. This was something that one of my early mentors turned me on to. So I think when 9 to 5 started, our picture was that we would just gather a whole lot of people, get them all in the room, and then try to figure out what to do with them. But what he said was, have something for them to do. Get moving, and people will get on the train. People, the train is leaving, it's time to get on, and that was what will attract people to your organization. So listen, be flexible, really listen to what people are saying, create roles for different kinds of people, and remember the rock pile theory and get away from it.
I love that. Also, can I add one, which is, I think, have your goals set up. I mean, sometimes
Absolutely.
that's something I'm very focused on at the Workers' Circle. I think very often we have so many goals that we lose sight of, of the order we want them in. You sort of, I'm a fan, and of course there's many ways to organize, of determining what you want to achieve short-term and long-term and going for it and celebrating.
Right.
I mean, that's a big part.
And that goes together with listening to what people are actually
Exactly.
wanting to do.
Well, exactly. Yeah. Sometimes it seems so immovable or it seems enormous, but if you break things down, you can often, into achievable goals or, manageable and education and research, it really comes together. But I love all of your different pieces, and you've seen it work, it sounds like, again and again and again. So, speaking of either the 3-day campaign or another campaign, give us an idea of some of the tactics for these 9 to 5ers that achieved, and maybe throw in some of the goals that you were seeking.
Yeah. So it all boiled down to 3 key tactics. One was public embarrassment for the boss. One was government action. These there were all these laws on the books and the government agencies, and for the most part, they were kind of sitting there unused. And we brought that to the attention of those officials and told them, use those powers, and a lot of them did. And then the third thing was creating these safe ways for women to make their voices heard without losing their jobs. So I talked about how we declared 1979 the year of the First National Bank. And that announcement appeared in the newspaper. And that very day, the bank announced, okay, we'll give you the first thing that you've demanded, which was job posting. Namely, that if there was a job opening, it would be posted on the bulletin board and everybody could see it. So it wasn't a case of the boss calling up his friend and saying, oh, I heard your son was looking for a job. Everybody would get to see it. There was a lot of resistance to that among managers who just wanted to do it the old way. So we won that first thing. And so the very next day, we were out in front of the bank with our leaflet saying, first victory at the first. Then we designed a survey, a leaflet that was a survey, and we passed that out, and it said, tell us what it's like to work at this bank. I mean, we already knew that there were a lot of problems there, but people would pass them back to us anonymously. And then the next day, we were back there, here's what you all had to say about what it's like to work in the bank. And this was extremely embarrassing to the bank. The bank managers knew that was happening, and what is a bank? It all depends on reputation and looking good in public. And this didn't look good. We got community organizations, churches, unions who had accounts at the bank to write in and say, we don't like what you're doing with your employment practices, and we're putting you on notice. And all of that was very painful to the managers. We got the federal government investigating them for not living up to their official affirmative action plans that they had to file with the Treasury Department. And we demanded that when those investigators came in from the government, they should talk to the workers, not just the managers who would say, oh yeah, we're doing everything fine. No, talk to some of the employees. And the government pressured the bank, and that had a huge impact. And then let me say, they were afraid of a union. Halavai, as we say in Yiddish, if only. But it really worked to our advantage that they thought we'd better give these women something or else they're going to ask for worse. And in the end, as I said, we won training programs, we won career ladders, we won a grievance procedure, which was amazing, and we won a huge raise.
I mean, those are many of the features of union protection, so it's incredible. And I just want to say, I hear from a lot of employers, there's a real movement in the nonprofit world that staffs are seeking to unionize. And in fact, this year, the Workers' Circle professional staff unionized. And as a former union leader myself, I was really proud to recognize them and be part of negotiating their first contract. And I advocate to managers and to other CEOs that workers who are heard and can contribute are the best workers. A workforce where people are respected produce, at a top level. And there's no reason to be afraid if you're persecuting your workers, but not if you're treating them with respect, because hopefully we're all in it together. But unfortunately, and in the corporate world, that's, a lot of people don't subscribe to equality. And so you dealt with it at a particularly difficult moment. And we're going to talk a little bit about today that we're still in difficult moments. So I think we really talked about some, but you talked about a 3-day campaign. I'm curious about how long maybe the longest campaign, and I wanted to probe a little bit and hear about the short term and the long term. You've said some of it, but one of the biggest challenges that I have found is keeping people engaged for the long haul, understanding that you may not get the changes you seek in a year. And you have to it doesn't mean you give up, but you have to keep people's energies high. So I'm curious, with the workers you were organizing, what did you do for the long term?
Yeah, so part of it had to do with the fact that we had created this kind of freewheeling community organizing style of an organization. It wasn't that we had an election date set and we had to move toward that and get everybody in line and win or lose. It wasn't all black and white like that. And I actually think that that's where the future of the labor movement lies, is a blend of the workplace by workplace organizing that's the traditional National Labor Relations Board organizing, plus this more, wild kind of organizing that we did that created a huge change. But I think the key is that as we went along, we set these very short-term winnable goals, and we cleaned everything. Will Mr. So-and-so from the employment agency meet with us? Yes. Victory! And we claimed that victory. Yeah. When the bank said they would post jobs, huge victory. We celebrated. We told everybody about it. We publicized it. Can we get X number of people to come to our hearing? Can we get in the newspaper? And we made sure to claim every one of those steps and take pride in it and feel great as a group about that. Another thing was that we kept the focus on the boss. We linked arms and went forward and went toward the target, and we just kept moving. We had a lot of fun. We had this antic tone in a lot of the stuff that we did, the bad boss contests. One time we were standing out in front of the Cleveland Library ringing cowbells for some reason. It was just madcap stuff, and it was fun. I think when I look back at what we won, some of it was very short-term things and very direct victories, like we asked for X, we got X. And some of it was the big cultural shift that took place, where bosses all over the country, people we'd never met, started making their own coffee, and women we had never met started feeling empowered to demand better treatment. And part of it was the movie, and part of it was that we were in the newspapers and on TV all over the country. Why did women become labor leaders and devote the rest of their lives to the labor movement? Because they'd been involved, and it wasn't like a short-term thing. It turned into a long-term thing because we built a movement. So the direct wins that we were careful to claim fed into this overwhelming cultural change that took place, and it all mattered. The little things mattered, and the big things mattered.
It's incredible, and it just resonates. So my last job was as the assistant executive director of the Writers Guild, and everything you're saying is so relevant to the union campaigns and the actions around contract tables. And just as an aside, my sister is also a union leader, and it's always about the small, the large, setting different goals. And I really think that that's still so important. And I really want to put in a plug, because sometimes when I see activism in front of us, it seems like there's no celebration of the small. I mean, small but steady wins the race still. So when you're fighting for something and you have an elected official turn and make changes, like, it's something I really hope people celebrate. It's when at the Workers' Circle we fought for President Biden to support the idea, to support the concept that the filibuster should not be a rule that applies to voting rights legislation. And we, for weeks, we and other organizations were outside the White House fighting for this, doing civil disobedience. And ultimately he changed his position. And we celebrated. We haven't gotten the voting rights legislation, but we did celebrate. And that's just a plug I put in, because it's interesting. It's always a part of a successful campaign, and I hope people really hear that. So your book really speaks about the subjugation and demands on women workers, which, as much as things have changed, really I find resonant today. And certainly in many fields, the subjugation of women still exists, very much front and center. You talk about positive changes also, which also it's a different world in some ways. And having the first AFL-CIO woman president is something that really I'm in awe of and so thrilled. But as I'm saying, there is still many changes to come. There's a big pay gap, and and many ongoing gender-based issues in the workplace. Could you talk about, looking at it, what issues are most important to you that you would call out for workplace equality today?
How much time do we have?
I know. And soon, I think after the next question, I'm going to go to the questions here. So we'll, I saw a couple coming in.
So, there's so many, but I would say that the extreme income inequality that we have in the United States today that keeps workers scrabbling for subsistence pay on the bottom and then rewards other people with billions, is that going to change? That's something I think we really need to address. The work-family crunch, it is shocking that the United States work world is so rigid that I don't, the pressure that working families are under is extreme. And it's reflected in the pay gap because women can't do it all, and when men chip in, as it were, they sometimes suffer at the workplace too. And then I guess another thing would be, how are we going to solve the problem that workers do not have collective power in the main? We did not organize 20 million office workers, alas, as we had dreamed of doing. And working women will not have the power that we need to live good lives on the job until we act collectively. And whether that, I made reference earlier to how I think we need a blend of the, election by election organizing plus something more freewheeling, like what 9 to 5 represented, that will just kick the ball down the field a little more. And I guess I would say, and you've made reference to this, Anne, is that the biggest thing facing us right now is getting out the vote. And I know that Workers' Circle is having a phone bank tonight, right after this, this hour is over. And I just think between now and November, there is nothing more important for women's equality and for quality of life on this planet than getting out the vote.
Thank you, and thanks for the reminder. If you're watching right now, you can go to circle.org/events and sign up. Oh, I see, and it's in the chat. You can sign up for the phone bank that's happening right after Ellen and I sign off, but it will not be on this Zoom. It'll be a new Zoom. And something the Workers' Circle is doing this year is we're committed to connecting over 250,000 voters in voter suppressed areas with a voting plan. It's a time when it's not just about registering people to vote. We're looking at millions of voters in the United States who want to vote and are going to find state legislated obstacles to voting. So it's a very, very serious threat to our democracy that people aren't going to be able to cast their ballots. And so our calls, our phone banks are all going to voters in voter suppressed states to help them plan their voting plan, set up a voting plan right now so that they know what IDs, where their poll may be because it may be moved, what days. A lot of early voting is being eliminated. So we don't want people to look November 1st and realize they didn't have a chance to early vote and there's a big line. So please get involved, sign up, and postcarding. Oh, somebody is saying about postcarding. Actually, phoning, texting, and postcarding are all equally important right now. So we do all of that. Stay with Workers' Circle, but we are doing this phone bank. And I saw there was some good questions. Someone had asked you to talk about the difficulties you had finding a union when the 9 to 5 women decided to organize into a union.
Yeah, so when we got going in the early 1970s, we went around Boston and we talked to all the union officials we could find, all men, and we heard some pretty shocking things. One man said to us, organizing office workers, like the city, this Boston ran on a paper economy. It was all office workers. He said, that's a good idea. If I could get a girl in here to do my typing, I'd be out in the field with you, he said. Wasn't exactly what we wanted to hear. But, George Meany was quoted saying, someone said, well, why is it that the labor movement is shrinking? He said, I don't know and I don't care. What I care about is the organized worker. That's the person, the fellow we care about. And in some ways, that had worked in the 1950s. There was a harmonious labor management contract at the time. But in the 70s, that was breaking down, and it was time for unions to start organizing, and many unions were just not set up for it. And I think one of the most important things we did was to demonstrate to the labor movement what are some techniques for reaching women workers? What did women care about? Could you organize? Could you have women organizers? Yes, you could. I think we were a demonstration project that really changed the labor movement.
Mac wants to know if you have tips for today's organizers.
Yeah, well, I think read my book.
Definitely, and right after this, we'll do the raffle. So keep going,
Okay,
and
good.
you'll be able. And you should also consider, if you didn't win the raffle, that we'll share a link so you can buy it.
Yeah. So people ask me this, and what I say is that learn from what we did. Learn from my wisdom, whatever. But I think just remember, we were 22. We didn't know what we were doing. But we just sort of followed our noses and got on with it. And I think that today's activists are going to do the same thing. And there are many situations that are really, people say to me, how do you organize remote workers? What do you do about gig work? Well, we didn't have that back then, and I don't know the answers. But today's activists are going to figure that out. And I think just having knowing that you never win it all, but you just need to persist and keep at it and think of yourselves as forging your own link in the chain. That's all anybody can do. And I find that actually kind of strangely consoling, is that, you're always looking beyond what you've been able to win. You're always going to the horizon and beyond. When you win something, it just whets your appetite for more. And you do, it's not for you to complete the task. And that's all any of us have ever been able to do. And so I feel very hopeful about the people today who are doing that postcarding and making those phone calls and organizing those unions. And I feel hope for the future.
And I want to just put in a plug for the PRO Act, which is out there. And one of the reasons we need people to vote. I heard the numbers, which I love, about over 70% of United States people support unions. Mm-hmm. Well, if all of those people vote and put in elected officials who are accountable to them and mm-hmm. say, we want this the PRO Act, which is a pro-union act. I mean, things like that mm-hmm. will pass. I mean, that's one area. Of course, we also, I think we can both speak to reproductive freedom, mm-hmm. the Equal Rights Amendment, dare I say. Yes. There's a lot out there, but it all starts with a healthy democracy. I see here, there's so many interesting questions. Kat wants to know why the U.S. is so different from other countries in terms of equal pay and women's equality.
Yeah, well, other countries have a more robust history of a labor movement that has continued to grow, and an understanding among employers that this is part of doing business. And that all began, that existed in the 1950s in the US, and it began to change in the 70s with the rise of anti-union consultants, union-busting consultants. And it really took off in the 80s. Ronald Reagan was very important in firing air traffic controllers at the beginning of the 1980s, and that the labor movement took a huge hit. So individualism is woven into the fabric of the United States, and we have a really different history. We also have a lot of strengths. We are a pluralistic society with a exciting mix of ethnicities and races that I think is going to work to our advantage going forward. But we've got a lot to overcome. So
I'm going, in a few minutes, I'm going to do the raffle, and we'll say goodnight to everyone, and maybe we have another Zoom in our future, dare I say. I'm curious because something that's so critical is lifelong activism. That's something I think what we're seeing now with the decline of our democracy, I think, is that a lot of us took a lot for granted. And what we're seeing is it's really a lifelong commitment to the rights that you hold close, be it labor rights, reproductive freedoms, our democracy overall. So what have you done to sustain yourself? Because here you are, as you say, 50 years in, which means you were, of course, a teenager when it all. What have you done to keep going and stay strong?
Yeah, well, I've talked about, I think I can't say too many times that it is a long time struggle. We're never going to win it all. We're never going to get there. And so being able to build a sustainable lifestyle for yourself is very important through all the things we've talked about, setting goals and having other people who you feel close to. It was working in that little office, when on Friday afternoons we would knock off early, which meant 5 o'clock. And we'd go to this happy hour in a nearby restaurant and just sit there for hours because we couldn't get enough of each other. So we had a ball doing this. It was great. But I think in January of 2017, right after Donald Trump was inaugurated, I was living in Washington, D.C. at the time, and the streets of the city filled up with hundreds of thousands of women who were packed in there for the Women's March. And there were some people staying with us who had never been to a demonstration before, but they had to be there. And those women reminded me of the women of 9 to 5. And I was so moved by them. And that was when I decided to write my book. And I felt like it's happening. It's happening again. And I think those are the women who've gone on to be the phone bankers and the postcard writers and the texters who, our democracy depends on them. And that's just fabulous.
And if I can also put in one more plug in the knot, is that take care of yourself. I mean, we're in it for the long haul. So that means take breaks. Find things that give you joy and don't feel like you have to be on the front lines all the time. Ebbs and flows, take care of yourself because we need you. So here are winners of your book. Thank you for being a part of this. Carol Pevney, Diana Draper, Helen Newman, Joanne Weiss, Kat Kramer, who one of the questions we asked, Mark Petriquin, Wesley Brown, Fred Dugan, Judith Gerber, and Joshua Safran. We'll be in touch with all of you. You should look for an email from dgold@circle.org, and we'll be sending your books. And for the rest of you, we will be sending you an email with a link to buy the book, and I believe it's also here, and you can search it. Ellen Cassedy, The 9 to 5 Movement, will get you there. I think we should all read it. In fact, I'm thinking maybe the next Zoom is a book discussion.
Cool.
That's what I was thinking.
Yeah, and feel free to be in touch with me. I'm online, ellencassedy.com, and I would love to hear from you.
And we hope to see you at some Worker Circle events because we are making history. So if you haven't already, sign up for the upcoming Zoom. Yeah, right after this program. So you still have time. Go to there's a link in the chat. Sign up and you can jump on a Zoom and make a difference in our democracy. It's right there, 7 p.m. Sign up for the phone banks with us tonight. All right, I thank all of you. Thank you for joining us, and we'll see you soon. And maybe we'll see you in a few minutes at the at our phone banking Zoom. Take good care. Thank you, Ellen. This was incredible.
Thank you. It was great.